It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Manfred Goldberg. We're here in your beautiful apartment in Netanya, but you live in London. And Manfred, if you could just tell us a little bit about your origins and a little bit about your life.
Well, to begin at the beginning, both my parents were born in Poland. In my father's family, it was a tradition that the boys were sent to yeshiva when they were aged 14. And so my father went to yeshiva in Tarnov. He had attended the yeshiva almost 4 years when he received call-up papers to serve in the Polish army. The Polish army was renowned for their anti-Semitism, and my father told me he had payers at the time, and it would have been more or less committing suicide for him to enter the army. He managed to persuade them that he was the wrong age, but almost a year later he received the second call up, and this one he couldn't avoid. So with his father's blessing, he packed his peckle and he made his way illegally into Germany, where he managed to settle. A chaplain got busy and introduced him to a young lady, also from Poland, from home, and they married in a town called Kassel, where he had settled in 1927. I was born in 1930, and a younger brother in 1934. Despite having lived in Germany for more than 20 years, in the middle of 1939, the Nazis arrested my father and deported him to Poland. The Poles refused to accept him. They said he was a deserter because he hadn't served in the army, and sent him back to Germany. The Germans then said they would send him to a concentration camp. Not the family, just my father. My mother courageously began pleading personally with the Nazi office to give my father his freedom, and they said the only possibility is if he has an entry visa to another country, they would permit him to leave, otherwise it's concentration camp. Only my father, not the family. My mother, Leah Sholem, of course, tried everything possible, but so did every other Jew. Every Jew in Germany was clamoring to get one of those precious visas, and there were none to be had. Very few countries allowed any Jews in. Eventually, as a last resort, because we had some family living in Berlin, my mother, Leah Sholem, went to plead with the passport officer at the British consulate in Berlin. And she had the Almighty arranged that she saw the senior passport officer, whose name is Frank Foley. And if you look online, if you don't know the name, you'll read a heartwarming story. He ran a sort of secret operation, and he has saved in excess of 10,000 Jewish souls. He has now been recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous Gentiles. And he gave my mother a single visa for my father to leave for the UK. And he made a promise that within 7 to 8 weeks, he would manage to give us the rest of the family visas to join my father. Unfortunately, the Nazis insisted that my father leave within 24 hours. We thought it was a separation only for a few weeks, but 2 weeks after he left, the Second World War began. So England and Germany were now at war, and of course our dream of joining my father remained a dream. We were now trapped in Germany. So there you have the beginning of my testimony.
And when were you taken?
Well, they allowed us our freedom. Well, it wasn't real freedom. We had to wear a yellow star on our garments. We weren't allowed to enter any non-Jewish shops, and all Jewish shops have been either vandalized or closed down, expropriated. We had to buy everything in just one shop, which we were allowed to enter. We weren't allowed to have radios. They cancelled driving licenses. The Jews couldn't drive any longer. We weren't even allowed to have a bicycle. We couldn't go to the cinema. So we were effectively sort of very, very severely curtailed in our freedom. But we managed to keep going until the end of 1941. There was a knock on our door. My mother, Olea Sholem, was given 10 minutes to pack a suitcase, and two Nazi men escorted us to the railway station, where we met a large crowd of Yidden, all accompanied by a suitcase, and eventually around 1,000 of us were packed into a train, and we began a journey into the unknown. They didn't tell us where they were taking us. We traveled for 3 days and nights. We were ordered out, and we found we'd been taken to our first camp in Riga, the capital city of Latvia.
And Manfred, can I just ask, when you were in Riga, did you go, or did you hear of Rumbala?
Did I what?
Hear of the Rumbala in the forest?
Well, when we arrived in the Riga ghetto, it was almost empty. But the Nazis occupied Riga around July 41, and they built this ghetto very quickly in a matter of a few weeks. And then they compelled almost 30,000 Riga Jews to leave their homes and move to live in the ghetto. This was around August, late August of 41. The Riga Jews had to move into the ghetto. And later that year, in November of 41, they took these Jews in groups. They lied to them. They told them that they were being taken to another camp. And in fact, they were marched into the Rumbula forest, where the Nazis had, by using slave labor, dug 3 enormous pits.
I was there.
Yeah. And in a matter of something like 10 days, all 30,000 Riga Jews were murdered. So the Riga ghetto was now empty, and they were now refilling it with us, with transports from Germany. Every few days, 1,000 or so Jews arrived from different towns, from Köln, Hanover, Berlin, Dortmund. So until, again, more than 30,000 German Jews were now living in the Riga ghetto. All healthy, young, strong young men.
30 Riga Jews.
30 Riga Jews.
They spoke German. That's
And
why
the main reason for sparing their lives was that they all spoke fluent German. And the Nazis then appointed these 30 to be our internal camp police. They didn't have much power. They just had some authority within the camp to stop quarrels among inmates. You know, if people lost their temper or were hungry, we were all on a starvation diet, of course, from the day we arrived. And it was these witnesses, they were eyewitnesses to the massacre. They told us the story I've related to you.
About Rumbala. They were eyewitnesses what was happening in Rumbala.
That's right. Yes.
So you knew it was happening.
Yes, it was directly from them. They told us what they had witnessed, how it happened. And less than 2 weeks after the last Latvian Jew was murdered, German Jews were already pushed into the camp to repopulate it.
And can I just ask, have you ever been back to Germany?
I went back to Stutthof in 2017 to meet the royal couple of Prince William and Princess Kate.
Where did you go?
In total, I was in 6 different camps. The last one was a camp called Stutthof, which towards the end of the war was a mini Auschwitz. It's much smaller than Auschwitz, but it had its own gas chamber and crematorium. And a lot of Jews were murdered there.
And
My brother...
I mean, your brother and your...
No, my brother was 4 years younger than I. He survived from 1941 to 1943. In 43, we were sent to another camp, which was a labor camp. And in in that camp, if you didn't labor, you didn't live.
Aye.
And there were 4 young children. It appeared that the Nazis had Rachmanis, and they permitted these 4 children to stay in the camp during the day. I was age 13, I was already a slave laborer. So both my mother, Olea Sholem, and I were marched out with a group every day to repair railway lines which the Allies were bombing, because the Nazis needed the railway lines to send supplies to their troops fighting at the front line against Russia. And we had to dig up the bomb-damaged rails, prepare the ground and lay new rails so that the Nazi trains could run. And one day we came home from work and these 4 children had disappeared. A member of the kitchen staff, who was one of the very few people who were in the camp during the day, everybody else was out at work, they were preparing some food for us for when we came home from work. He told us that 2 SS officers had come into the camp, had taken the 4 children away, and despite searching post-war for years and years, because I had a dream that Nace would have happened and he would have survived and somehow we would meet, I refused to accept that he was murdered. But eventually, not so many years ago, I finally had to admit defeat and recognize that it was just a dream. The chances are that these 4 children were murdered the day they were taken from the camp. And such was life there that the following morning, both my mother and I had to report for work, as though nothing had happened.
Aye. Sure. And Manfred, can I just ask, do you remember Kristallnacht?
Of course I do. I was 8 years old. Yes, I do.
And you remember the shul being burnt? Or did they burn down the shul?
There was a shul not far from where we lived. It was not an Orthodox, it was a Reform shul. It's one we never went to. My father davened in a small Ostjüdische shul, organized, that there were 2 kehillas in Kassel, the German Jews and the Ostjuden, and there was no love lost. The German Jews did not like the Ostjuden. They were too religious. They were rocking the boat for the Germans, because they were much more assimilated. And that was one shul which the German Jews had, a large shul. And we could see flames from it, yeah. It was totally vandalized and burnt, and eventually it was demolished.
And can I just ask, Manfred, after the liberation, do you remember the liberation?
Of course I remember the liberation.
Who liberated the camps?
We were liberated by the British, not in a camp. We were sent on a death march. And a very peculiar death march. In fact, I've been asked to speak about it by the Wiener Library. If you look online on the Wiener Library, you'll see testimony from me, which is headed My Death March Experience. You can hear the talk.
And were you with your mother on the marches?
I didn't know. My mother was not together with me. We were in separate camps. I was with the men, and she was in the women's camp. So one morning in April 45, they put the group of us men aside, and we were marched out of Stutthof under armed SS guards. And then as we were marching, we saw that from the ladies' camp, also a column of ladies were marched out, and eventually the 2 merged. We were just one long column. So of course I immediately began sort of wending my way through the column to see whether I could find my mother. I didn't know whether she was marching or whether she was left behind, because it wasn't a complete camp. They only took a proportion of the people to send on this death march. And she likewise didn't know whether I was marching or whether I was left behind. So each of us searched for the other, and I don't know how long it took, but eventually we were overjoyed to find each other. We had no idea what our fate would be, what was ahead of us, but at least we would experience it together.
And when were you reunited with your father?
Pardon?
When were you reunited with your father?
It took a long time. It took several months. We were interviewed by a welfare officer who asked for details. All we could give him was my father's name, date of birth, the place he was born, names of brothers and sisters. We didn't know where he was, somewhere in the UK. And he said, don't worry, we'll find him. But it took about 3 months until they located him. And my father gave details of the family he was looking for. There was an office opened in London by the chief rabbi of the time, where refugees could give details of the families they left behind, because he wasn't the only one. There were many refugees who were looking for family. And it took 3 months or so for them to match the two searchers. And he applied for permission to bring us to the UK. We didn't arrive in England until September 46.
Wow, you had to wait. It's a long time.
A long time.
And were you in a DP camp?
I was in a DP camp, but only for a matter of days. I then developed typhus. Both my mother and I were taken to hospital. And while I was in hospital, they discovered that I also had tuberculosis, which I didn't even know, but they found it in hospital. So I had longer treatment, and then they said I was well enough to leave hospital, but not well enough to sort of go out into the world. I had to go on convalescence. And because I was only 15 years old, my mother, Olea Sholem, was permitted to accompany me. So both of us were sent to a convalescent home to fully recover. And no one told us to leave, so we stayed there for a year or so, until we finally, from there, we went to England to meet my father again, who was a stranger to me. I hadn't seen him for 7 years.
But it must have been very emotional,
Yes.
and for your mother as well.
Yes, of course. I was 9 years old when we parted, and 16 when we met again. And of course I had no schooling for 7 years, because I attended the Jewish school. There was only one Jewish primary school in our town, which I attended, but not long after Kristallnacht, the Germans, the Nazis, closed our school, and all Jewish children who attended non-Jewish schools were expelled from school, so there was no education for any Jewish child after that. And of course in the camps I had no education, I had slave labor, and this was 7 years later. I don't think I have time to tell you now, but I had one remarkable experience. I actually had a formal Bar Mitzvah in the Riga ghetto.
In the wow.
Yes.
Or if you could just mention a little bit, that's incredible.
Yes, I think it is. One of the teachers of the Jewish school I attended was also sent to Riga, part of our transport. His name was Bacher, Herr Bacher, and he was a very dedicated teacher who loved children. And in the Riga ghetto, children under the age of 13 did not have to work. That was the only camp where children under 13 were allowed to stay in the camp during the day. So my mother had to go out to work every day in factories producing goods to help the German war effort. And I had to look after my little brother. I was 11 and he was 7. So children we were not the only ones, all the children from our town sort of lived together. They housed us in one street, and children periodically got into trouble doing things they weren't supposed to do. And this Herr Bacher pleaded with the Judenrat in the camp to give him the use of one room where he could assemble all the Kassel children daily. He would try and teach them. He had no facilities, but from knowledge in his head, he would try and give them some verbal teaching. But it didn't work very well, because some children were 4 years old and some were 11 and 12, so the little ones had no patience to keep quiet. And so eventually he realized that it was not working, and he was a remarkably talented and gifted man. He formed us into a choir, and everyone from the little up to age 12, because by 13 you have to go out to work. He began teaching us nigunim from our tefillahs, like Matovo, Adon Olam, Yigdal, Tzadik Hatomo Yifroch. All these melodies I learned there.
And you were singing it in the ghetto?
In that room where he assembled us. In fact, we got so good that he divided us and we were harmonizing. We were quite a decent choir. And when I passed my 12th birthday, this Herr Bacher said to me, you know, your Bar Mitzvah is coming up. I know you haven't got your father. Normally your father would see to it. Would you like me to help you? Well, I was a good boy, although I wasn't sure just how he was going to help me. I said, yes, please, Herr Bacher. And he began calculating which my setter, he didn't have a luach, he had to do it all mentally. So he calculated that my Bar Mitzvah Parsha would be Parsha Tzav. And he began teaching me to lane. And when he realized that I was learning it pretty easily, he taught me the whole setter from beginning to end. And what's more, he had calculated that Shabbat would be Shabbat Parshat Parah. So he taught me the extra laning from Chukas, and he taught me the Haftarah for Parshas Parah. And I learned the whole lot. And what was most remarkable is because everyone had to go out to work 7 days a week, Shabbos, Yom Tov, everyone had to work. And he managed, I don't know how, to get 9 men together, and I, for the first time, was counted as number 10.
As a minion?
We had a minion, and we had a Sefer Torah.
You had a Sefer Torah?
Because the Riga Jews, when they had to move from their homes into the ghetto, they were allowed to take things with them. And many of them must have been Rabbonim. There must have been dozens of Botei Knesset, 30,000 Yidden. So what does the Rav think of to take?
The Sefer Torah.
The Sefer Torah. So many of them took Sifrei Torah into the camp, as well as other Sforim, you name it, and it was there. And when they were marched into the Umbula forest to be murdered, they weren't allowed to take anything. It was all left behind. And we were housed in the same rooms, same houses that they had occupied, so we found all their belongings. They were all left behind. They were murdered, but the belongings stayed in the apartments, and we entered these apartments on the Nazis' orders and lived in them. So we had access to Sifrei Torah, and he managed to get a hold of a Sefer Torah for my Bar Mitzvah Shabbat.
And your mother could attend? She could?
Pardon?
Your mother was there? Your mother heard you?
My mother managed to take a day off, and she was there.
It is, what a miracle beyond miracles.
I don't know of any other sort of young man or young boy for whom Bacher did it, unless he did it very quietly and I didn't know about it. I'm the only one who I know about, and that was the only religious service I experienced in 3.5 years in the camp. There was never a minyan before, and the rest of the time, nothing ever.
And what happened to your teacher? Did he manage to survive?
I searched for him post-war, but I couldn't find anything about him.
What a tzaddik, what an amazing person.
Yeah.
Manfred, this is unbelievable. It's something...
And he taught me so well that I taught our 4 boys their Bar Mitzvah parshas, and each one of them learned the full parsha. And I was their teacher.
Can I just ask you, do you remember some of the nigunim? Just a little bit?
Of course.
Could you do a little? Just a little.
That was Matovu, Aholecho Yaakov, Mishkanasecho Yisrael, Yigdal Elohim Chai Tzadikato Yefro. These are the nigunim he taught me, and each time I hear them in shul, it brings back memories to me to this day.
So Manfred, I have to ask you. I mean, you went through Gehenna, you went through really, and you wear a kippah, and you've remained through all this. You kept your emunah, you kept your faith.
I didn't keep my emunah. I didn't have any emunah in the camps. I didn't daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I didn't know how to daven. One thing that I'd like to make clear, although it's 5 to 6, I'll give you another 5 minutes.
Okay.
And that's
I
it.
know. Okay.
You're very good.
No, I just, it's unbelievable.
Well, I attended the only Jewish primary school. There was very little mixing between the Polish community and the German, but all children could attend that primary school. But it was orientated primarily to teach the German Jewish children, and they were not sort of on a high religious madrega. There were a few really sincerely religious German Jews, but the majority were what they called Deutsche, the jüdischen Glaubens, Jews of the Hebrew persuasion. So the religious level in that school was not all that high. They taught us to read. I could recognize the Hebrew letters, but I was not taught much about tefillah or the practices of Judaism, and I stopped there before I was 9 years old, and after that absolutely no example to follow. As a little boy, I would walk to shul on Shabbos morning with my father, Oliver Sholem, but I really was not at any religious level that you expect nowadays from a 9-year-old who attends a Jewish school. Our expectations have changed. So I didn't daven. When I came to meet my father, he had not lost his faith, despite the agony of not knowing for 6 years whether his family was alive or not. When I came, he went to shul, of course, not only on Shabbos, but every morning. He went to shiurim. He had his chavrusas, his friends as well, and he expected me to follow. But although I was a good boy and I followed, I put on a kippah and I went to shul with him, but it didn't really mean anything to me. I didn't have the heart to rebel against my father, so outwardly I did everything that was required. In fact, when we made contact with my father from Germany, the first parcel he was allowed to send us contained a pair of tefillin and a siddur for me. I had never ever put on a pair of tefillin before. I didn't know how to do it. So that will have to do now.
Okay, and can I just ask, in which area did you live in London?
My father lived in Stamford Hill.
And you grew up in Stamford Hill?
Well, from age 16 until I got married, and then heartbreakingly, my mother, Olea Sholem, died a few weeks before our wedding. My father didn't want to move. We wanted to move to northwest London, but my father insisted Stamford Hill is where he lives, and he has his friends there, he has his shul, he has his shiurim there. So we changed our plans, and we, as a married couple, lived in Stamford Hill to be near my father, so he could come to us for Shabbos easily and so on. And we lived in Stamford Hill for 15 years post-marriage.
Manfred, the last thing, what message do you give to the children and to the future generations? Or what advice do you give?
I don't always give the same message, but one very basic message is that never to remain silent when you witness an injustice. because evil triumphs when good people remain silent. And I ask people not only to listen to me saying it, but I ask them to engrave it into their hearts and act on it.
It's such a profound message. It's so special. And I just want to end off, this is the book of portraits of survivors.
7,
And
yes, these are the 7 of us.
and this was a project of Prince Charles.
Yes, he paid for these were distinguished painters. He paid for them. The portraits are the property of Prince Charles, of the royal family. And they'll hang for generations in the
Parliament.
royal display in Buckingham Palace.
So Manfred, I just want to thank you so much. I'm just going to, but I am so grateful to you, and there are no words, and you should just have Mazel Bracha at Mevesurim in good health.
Amen.
And there are no words. From the bottom of my heart, I'm so grateful to you. It is very, very special. Sure. And you should just be well, and really, I'm so extremely grateful to you.